uh, greetings to one and all who joined us. So thank you for joining us on this very special day for this very special conversation to understand more about this very special book, which has been very timely, titled India's Undeclared Emergency, Constitutionalism and the Politics of Resistance by Arvin Narayan and published by Westland Books. The event is jointly organized by Environment Support Group, PUCL, Manthan Law, and Westland Books. The format of the evening will be a setting of the tone for the conversation by Leo Saldana, followed by Arvin, who will talk about the book and its various sections, and that will be followed by a response to the book itself by Professor Ram Guha, Madhu Bhushan, and Professor Babu Matthew. We will then open the forum for question and answers. So before we start, a very quick introduction to our speakers. Arvin Narayan, as we all know, is a lawyer, writer based in Bangalore. He is a founding member of the Alternative Law Forum, a collective of lawyers based in Bangalore. He's also a visiting faculty at the School of Policy and Governance, Azim Premji University. He's also pursuing his PhD at the National Law School of India University, in which he is looking at the legal and the political thought of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. He's the co-editor of Law Like Love, Queer Perspectives on Law, and co-author of Breathing Life into the Constitution, Human Rights Lawyering in India and the Preamble, a brief introduction. He was also part of the team of lawyers that challenged Section 377 of the IPC right from the High Court in 2009 to the Supreme Court in 2018. Arvind has recently authored India's Undeclared Emergency, Constitutionalism and the Politics of Resistance, for which we are all here. Thanks a lot, Arvind, for agreeing to talk about this book on this very special day and for your time. Then we have Professor Ramchandra Guha, who is a historian and a biographer based in Bengaluru. His books include A Pioneering Environmental History, The Unquiet Woods, published by the University of California Press way back in 1989. He's an award-winning social history, it was an award-winning social history of cricket. Then he's also the author of A Corner of a Foreign Field, which was chosen by The Guardian as one of the 10 best books on cricket ever written. Then, of course, India After Gandhi, published by Macmillan in 2007, which was chosen as a book of the year by The Economist, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal, and as a book of the decade in the Times of London and The Hindu. We are very grateful to Professor Guha for agreeing to be one of the respondents and immediately agreeing to give his time on this very special day to spend this evening with us. Thank you, Professor Guha. We then have Madhu Bhushan, who's an independent activist, researcher, and an occasional filmmaker as well. Madhu Bhushan has earlier worked with the CH Collective and Vimochana for more than 3 decades till 2014. She has now been involved with an initiative called the Gamana Mahila Samuha, a feminist collective, where she's also engaged with various networks and organizations working on human rights and social justice, including rights of sex workers, trans communities, and the Adivasis. And she's been involved in crisis intervention and community outreach campaigns and advocacy for a very long time, with a focus on rural and tribal communities. Our sincere thanks to Madhu Bhushan again for having immediately agreed to this book response and saying that, oh, I need a signed copy from Arvind if I'm doing this. I hope you got your signed copy, Madhu. And we have Professor Babu Matthew, who is a former registrar and faculty at NLSIU. He was also part of the trade union movement and various other social movements, taking up issues of bonded labor, child labor, displacement, and destruction of the livelihoods of the marginalized. He combined the teaching and practice of human rights. And during the last 6 years, he has also served as the country director of ActionAid International in India. In this capacity, he was in charge of evolving a rights-based policy and implementing a human rights agenda with special focus on economic, social, and cultural rights in 25 states of India. He led the process of presenting a shadow report focusing on the excluded communities of India before the relevant UN committee in Geneva. Thanks a lot, Professor Matthew, for agreeing to be part of this book conversation this evening. We are sincerely thankful for your time. Then we have Leo Saldana, who is the full-time coordinator and trustee of ESG. He has gained wide-ranging experience in the areas of environmental law and policy, decentralization, urban planning, and a variety of human rights and development-related issues, working across many, many sectors for over a decade. He's also a keen campaigner on critical environmental and social justice issues and has guided several campaigns demanding evolution of progressive laws and effective action. And our special thanks this evening to our student volunteers who will be tweet reporting, Anirudh, Anushri, and Bhavya in particular, and Medha, who's probably joining them as well. And another very special thanks to Varun John for holding all the technical support together and making this event possible. The event is being live streamed on Facebook and is also being tweet reported. Kindly do share and retweet the proceedings. So over to our speakers. So we will first have Leo Saldana, who will set the tone for the talk, and then over to Arvin. Our request with all the audience is to kindly keep your mics on mute and raise your questions in the chat box, which we will take towards the end. And kindly ensure there isn't other noises that will disturb this conversation. Thank you so much. Over to you, Leo.
Thank you, Bhargavi. And Bhargavi didn't introduce herself, but she is also co-founded and built Environment Support Group and has worked in advancing environmental and social justice across India. I just want to share in 2 minutes why we felt the need to organize this. Everyone feels stymied. We saw it 2 years ago when several of us were participating in the resistance to the Citizenship Amendment Act. And Ram Goa got picked up for coming to town hall for merely protesting against the act. I mean, protesting is a fundamental right. And to speak to the media and get arrested for that is something that we read about would happen during the emergency. And Ram was picked up, and in fact, my family got picked up. And when I ran from the High Court, because I was at the High Court to work with several other co-litigants to seek the indulgence of the Chief Justice to ensure the Section 144 that had been imposed overnight to prevent the protests at the town hall would be stayed. Unfortunately, that day the Chief Justice was unwell, but he did post it for an early hearing 2 or 3 days later. But the point really is that I was also there with Professor Rajagoda at that time, who was a co-litigant. At that time, he was the member of parliament of the Rajya Sabha. And we both went to the town hall and we saw a huge crowd which had gathered. Nobody invited them. Everybody turned up on their own. And it all happened just, without really, the way political rallies are organized. So it was representative of the outpouring of public anger and emotion against a law which was dividing us, which was making so many of us second-class citizens, so many of us non-citizens. So when we were there protesting, an incredible thing happened. 2 days before in Mangalore, 2 people had been shot dead for similarly participating in protests. And the police had turned out in full strength at the town hall of Bangalore and were just aching to arrest violently, in fact. And also, who knows what would have happened. It also turned out to be a Friday, and all our friends from across KR Market just shut their shops. Nobody invited them. They just came. And they all said that this is not about Muslims being targeted or whatever. We are all in this together. And they just sat there. And the police did their bit, arresting people in waves after waves after waves. But what was incredible about that day was the Bangalore police was forced to be restrained because everyone acted as one people that day. And they just couldn't arrest all of us. And everyone said, arrest, if you're arresting, take us all. We're not willing to get bail. We're not going to get out. We are in this together. And then the negotiation started. I remember Soumya Reddy, the MLA, turned up, and peanut sellers came and gave food. Street vendors came and gave food. The spirit of India came alive that day. You know, we don't know anyone there, and water bottles came from nowhere. And as the time wore on through the day and we reached 5 o'clock in the evening, the police were getting increasingly frustrated because the city had stopped functioning. And on that day, the police had to step back and respect democracy and the fundamental right of expression, which includes our right to protest, because the only demand everyone had there was everyone arrested gets out or everyone who's here gets into the jail. So obviously they couldn't take us into jail. And so they released everyone. And the second demand was they should be all brought to town hall. And only then people will disperse. So 6 o'clock in the evening, a protest which started at 10 in the morning ended on a very high note. And that, you know, set the tone for the type of representation of intent of the public at large and the peoples of India, as it was happening already in Delhi, to ensure that the government will be held accountable. And the government cannot just be unfettered. And that our legislative system and our parliamentary system, if it fails us, the people will stand up and people will get counted. And people will resist an attack on our fundamental freedoms, on our fundamental rights, and our democracy itself. So that was a huge, I would say, epochal moment in the history of the city, actually. But it was also a time when I think perhaps this influenced you, Arvind, as well, in sort of shaping the book, as it were, because subsequently we have seen horrors that have played out and resistances that have grown. So this really is a context in which we request you to sort of bring alive to us why you wrote this book, what compelled you, but more importantly, what does the book contain? So that we can all read it. And I have the book here. Thank you for not giving me a copy like you gave others. It is also not autographed, but I will make you autograph it. And I also didn't get the 40% discount, which Westland Books offers to everyone who has registered and is participating in this. So on all those counts, I feel cheated, but that apart, I'm benefiting from the fact that you're all here. I'm most grateful to Babu, to Ram, for Madhu, for being here with us and helping us understand what we are going through. So thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Over to you, Arvind.
Thanks to both Leo and Bhargavi for very spontaneously calling me up and saying we want to do an event on this particular book. It means a lot, and thank you so much for taking the initiative in the way you did, in that particularly spontaneous style, which is kind of a way of describing and thinking of the ESG and the kind of work it's done over the many years, really. And thanks also to my fellow panelists, and in particular Babu, Madhu, and Ram, who all of whom have read the book and have I'm sure, things to say from different angles. But just to crave their indulgence a little bit, I will take people a little bit through the book, only because we have an audience which is also outside the five of us. So to present one perspective of the book. So everybody is not on the same page, but has some sense of the terrain on which we're really carrying this debate forward. Leo asked the question as to why I wrote this book. And I think the impulse is really twofold. One is really in terms of how do we understand the contemporary moment? And secondly, how do we respond to it? That's the context out of which this book really, for me, emerged. And when I say understand the contemporary moment, obviously you got the context which Leo said. We share the same thinking, which is the idea that the contemporary moment, in many ways, is a moment when Indian democracy or the Indian Republic is under threat. The ways in which a certain kind of a history or a certain kind of a struggle, which resulted in the constitutional framework and the rights framework that we have, is now under erosion. And that's what I mean by the contemporary context. And how do we understand that moment is the question I started with. And for me, the one very important way of understanding the contemporary moment is really through the reporting of the alternative media. That's really the crux. In a sense, you see a lot of references are to articles by the alternative press, the alternative media, which has carried a lot of the material, a lot of the stuff I'm referring to. But I also felt that it's also useful to go a little outside our context, take a step back from where we are immersed, to look at things from the perspective of history, look at things from the perspective of other historical contexts. Because sometimes I felt a lighter shed on the contemporary just by that analogy, just by that historical moment, which might be very different, but in some ways also which might carry intimations of what the future may hold for us. That was really the where I was coming from, and that is really the way the book is written, or the way the book responds to the contemporary context. I began by looking at we had an event looking at the anniversary of the emergency, at which I made a presentation, and the book really arose out of that context. But when I went to the literature on the emergency, again, a lot of the really powerful material is in the Shah Commission report, which I think is really important reading for really everybody to get a sense of what the emergency was really about, or what the emergency felt like, as far as a lot of people were concerned. But in this book, I take one particular lens on the emergency, which is really to make the argument that the emergency is a period when there's an untrammeled use of the preventive detention law, which is the Maintenance of Internal Security Act. People can ask that surely Article 22 is there in the Constitution. Article 22 authorizes preventive detention. Surely there are other periods of time when preventive detention was used. That is true. But the point about the emergency is we have the question of untrammeled use of the preventive detention laws, and we have the complete failure of every other institution of accountability, be it the media, be it civil society, or be it most fundamentally and most importantly, the judiciary. And in this case, I go a little bit looking in particular judiciary and the role of in a sense, one of the low points of the Indian judiciary, which is the judgment in ADM Jabalpur, where the Supreme Court really upheld the fact that even when it comes to preventive detention, even when it comes to examining the constitutionality, examining whether a preventive detention order is in compliance with the preventive detention statute, the court has no such power. And that was a fundamental abdication of its constitutional responsibility by the Supreme Court. But 2 points over here again, which are worth noting in terms of thinking about the past to think about the future, or to think about the contemporary, which is 9 high courts stood up for the rights of the detained. Supreme Court let us down. The second point to be noted is 4 judges let us down, including Justice Chandrachud, the Chief Justice at the moment in time. But the dissent with Justice Khanna, which really upheld the right to liberty under all circumstances, is an important point to note. And here I make the point that sometimes we need to go to the archive to look at cases and look at where history may have gone or didn't go, to see if that can be part of the future. So Justice Khanna's opinion, or really brave dissent, in a sense, I look at that and say, can that kind of history, that kind of legacy be resurrected? Again, it's not a purely abstract invocation of in my thinking alone, because the question of Justice Khanna's dissent is today the mainstream of even judicial thought. In the Puttaswamy judgment, the Supreme Court excoriates the ADM Jabalpur majority judgment. And we have, in a sense, Justice Khanna emerging as the exemplar of what a judge should be like. So there's a certain value in going back to the emergency moment from this way of thinking about it. From the emergency, there's more to say, but I'm going to keep things brief so that I can take you quickly through what I'm trying to do as far as the book is concerned. When we come to the point I'm making is the 2 moments of greatest democratic decline. This is following Tarunab Khaitan's thesis or article, is the emergency in 1975 to 77 and the contemporary movement. And again, the particular lens I have on the 2 moments is really the unrestrained use of preventive detention laws. In the contemporary moment, the 2 laws which I'm most concerned, which I look at very, very closely, is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act as well as the NIA. And I just want to make a couple of points about the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. It begins as a criminalization of unlawful activities and unlawful association, goes on to criminalization of terrorism. And today, fundamentally, maybe the most important point about the UAPA is it is a de facto preventive detention law, more serious in its implication than even the preventive detention laws authorized from the Preventive Detention Act and Maintenance Internal Security Act onwards. The reason I make this is because of one fundamental point: the difference between the language of de facto and de jure. The Preventive Maintenance Internal Security Act was a de jure preventive detention law, which basically put a limit. The maximum period of detention was 1 year. If you go to the UAPA, we've seen the fact that people have been detained under the UAPA for 10 plus years. And that tells you a sense that today the danger of the UAPA, the fundamental danger of the UAPA, is as a preventive detention law. Of course, as any kind of example, if you need any kind of examples, which I go into a little bit, is of course the BK16, is of course the anti-CAA protesters, and is of course the people who are protesting in Kashmir post the revocation Article 370. So you get a sense of the way this particular law has really worked in the contemporary context. The other statute I go a little bit into is the NIA Act, and here I want to make a couple of quick points on this. The National Investigation Agency prides itself on being the premier intelligence agency in this country. The Home Minister takes great pride in announcing to Parliament that they have a 90% conviction rate. So you go a little bit and examine that. Justice Alam does this actually, the former retired judge of the Indian Supreme Court, and he makes this point that the figure of 90% really derives from a certain kind of a jugglery, where you say that in a particular year there were X number of cases which resulted in decisions, out of which a majority of those were convictions, therefore 90%. But the point he makes, a significant point, is that there is still a large majority of cases where there are no convictions and no acquittals. This is the fundamental reality of the UAPA. You remember the fact that there are no convictions and there are no acquittals, which means people are in jail year after year, held in a constant state of limbo, as it were. And so if you look at it from that perspective, then the NIA's conviction rate comes down to 27%. Give you a figure, 27%. It's not 90%, it's 27%. But even if you say 27%, as far as anti-terror laws go, that's a huge percentage. That's a very big success rate. Why I say that is if you look at the old history of Tada and Pota, Tada I think was 5% conviction rate. Pota is something on the lines of 2% conviction rate. Right? So that's a very, very low conviction percentage. Right? And how did the NIA get the figures of even 27%? And here there's a very important study by academic Kunal Ambasta and on the criminal law, and he makes the point that the strategy he's hypothesizing. We still don't know for sure because there still needs to be more evidence at this point. He's saying that the reason it happens is because the NIA strategy is one point. They will tell you, you have spent 5 years in jail. You plead guilty. If you plead guilty, we'll let you out. Others spend the remaining 5 years in jail. And every accused is presented with a Hobson's choice. What does the accused do in that particular context? What does the lawyer advise his client to do? It's a very difficult situation. And if this is the case, then we have many, many more questions to ask of the NIA. One more point I want to make about the NIA, which I think is an important point, is the question of the Samjauta blast case, where over 60 people who were mainly Pakistani pilgrims returning to Pakistan were killed in that particular blast. The NIA investigates this particular matter, and the NIA Sessions Court passes strictures against the NIA investigation. What he says, again, I won't quote what he says. He says, with deep pain and anguish, a dastardly act of violence remains unpunished because of gaping holes in the prosecution evidence. You read that judgment word to word, and he'll tell you that The NIA makes a case that there was meetings when Swami Asimanand, Pragya Thakur, etc. were there. They don't present the evidence of the meetings. They don't present fundamental points of criminal investigation like CCTV footage. They don't present call phone records to indicate, for example, this meeting of minds between different people. And so you get that sense, again, the way judges express it might not be expressed in florid prose, but when he says gaping holes in the prosecution evidence, he means a lot more than just merely gaping holes in the prosecution evidence. This is because if you are the premier investigation agency, you can't be having gaping holes in your evidence, which makes us ask many other questions. When it goes to Parliament, debate on this, the Home Minister says that no plea will be filed in this particular matter. And he seems to indicate that the political motive when even the filing of this case, so Samjhauta blasts were concerned. And there's one more point, which is, again, I'll make this one more point on this particular case, which is the Sessions Court judge, the NIA court judge, points to what an ASI called Kashmir Singh. And he says he's the real hero because he tried to rescue people from the burning coach. He went into the burning coach to rescue people and he lost his life. And he says he's deserving of the highest accolade and he keeps hope of a utopian society alive. You compare that to the statement of the Home Minister, who basically says that he's not going to file an appeal in spite of the fact that 67 people have lost their lives in this particular blast. So that tells you in a sense of these two put together, the UAPA and the NIA, tell you in a sense of the birth or the entrenchment, what you'd call a prerogative state, which is a boundless state of lawlessness at the heart of the constitutional order. And that is what the NIA and the UAPA are really about. And I think the point to be noted again, why you call this part the undeclared emergency, is because they have managed to continue to keep people within the prerogative state without any sense of check by either the media, by the judiciary, or by civil society. Civil society, again, just one quick point, UAPA and NIA are tools used to spread fear as far as civil society is concerned. If you go again through the entire question of the BK16, I just want to make one point in terms of the arrest of the BK16 itself. Why were the BK16 arrested? I think it's important to go through that once again, which is, if you look at the composition of the people who were the BK16, there were Dalit rights activists, there were lawyers, Adivasi rights activists, civil libertarians, and intellectuals. I'll make one quick point on each of the categories of groups, as it were. When it comes to Dalit rights activists, Beat Anand Teltumde, of course, is much broader than a Dalit rights activist in terms of he takes a position on a range of other issues. But if you think of him, as well as the point to make, activism that a Hindu Raj comes. Vernon Gonzalez, Arun Ferreira, the point again they make is a very important one. If we don't have lawyers pushing for accountability of the state, it'll be in a very different. Again, seeing the entrenched or this growing attacks on lawyers, and the BK16 is a beginning point of the entire attack on lawyers and their ability to take their work forward. If you look at the Mahmood Pacha case and the fact asked for in confidential, but charity of the way to the independence of lawyers who get independently. Then the Adivasi rights activism in terms of both Stan Swamy and Mahesh Raut, and the fact that, of course, Stan Swamy's tragic killing. That's the other point which tells you again that there's something very important which the Adivasi rights activists are saying. Again, you go to Father Stan's story, go to the information around his life. The point he's making is in terms of taking the constitution to the people, be it in the Padagadi movement. The point he's making is in terms of ensuring the accountability of the state for the arbitrary arrest of Adivasis, in terms of filing a petition in the High Court challenging that. And then we also have the civil liberties activism, which could be Rona Wilson and Gautam Navalaka, where the idea again of civil liberties activism is how do you expose, how do you bring the state within the state, the secret state, the deep state within some structure or accountability? That's a question in terms of the way state functions in Kashmir or Chhattisgarh or Northeast. In terms of the state, we mean the army, the police, the paramilitary, the intelligence agencies. And these are institutions which again need to become within the framework of the rule of law. And that's a work that very few people do. And these are some of the people doing that very important work. And the final part of the BK16 story is the attack on intellectuals. Again, if you look at Rao, he's 80 plus years old, as was Father Stan Swami. Why do you arrest somebody who's 80 plus years old? If you go to his book of poetry called Imprisoned Existence, what he says, there's a very beautiful foreword by the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o makes the point that the arrest, that the imperative of the state is to imprison imagination. But imagination cannot be imprisoned, as poets always function outside the question of prison walls. Again, you go back to Varavara Rao, the point he makes again and again is political prisoners know the meaning of hope, they do not know the meaning of despair. It's this kind of spirit which really the state's imperative is to tie down or bog down or kill in some fashion or the other. So in a sense, this is partly what I look at in terms of the role of the growth of the prerogative state and the undeclared emergency using the criminal law to crush in that sense of or to challenge or to destroy dissenting voices or to challenge dissenting voices, really. And from here I go to two other points, and I'm going to try and wrap up with this, is that I say that I look at the contemporary moment and say that is parallels with the emergency. But it's also far more challenging than the period of the emergency. The reason it's far more challenging than the period of the emergency is today is again, Gyan Prakash makes the important point that the emergency regime was ended with this sullen. Well, the reception to the emergency regime was sullen, not popular. People were not enthusiastic. There's nobody who can make the case that the regime today is not popular. There's deep roots as far as popularity is concerned. Logical framework. Logical framework is really based on a certain kind of, you read Golwalkar, you read Savarkar, you get a clear sense. It's based on the idea of who are the internal threats, who are the threats to your Hindutva nation. The threats, as far as Golwalkar is concerned, are what he describes as Christians, Muslims, and communists. Communists, of course, can be a very broad framework to include a range of people, as it were. But I think the broader point over here is really the discomfort with diversity, which is really the heart of the Indian society and Indian constitutional order. So the imperative to ensure that diversity comes within the straitjacket. That's really the imperative of a totalitarian framework or totalitarian aspirational totalitarian regime. And we see that discomfort with diversity in something like the love jihad law. We see that discomfort with diversity in terms of the Ayodhya judgment itself. And we see that discomfort with diversity in terms of the attempt to control the way you dress, who can attend schools, be it Muslim women in hijabs, or different manners of really taking on the dissenter or someone who produces a different narrative, as it were. I don't want to go too much more into the features which make this this regime inaugural. And I'll make two more quick points. Is that there's also, while there's a certain focus on the social and the cultural in terms of the politics of Hindutva, there's also at the same time, there's an attack on hard-won rights, be it the rights of labor, be it the rights of environment, be it the rights of environmental protection, be it activism against climate change, a range of ways in which you want to take forward another kind of agenda. Again, this calls to mind Naomi Klein's description of the idea of the shock doctrine. That is, you use a crisis as a mode to further disempower the most marginalized. We saw the recent Oxfam report, which indicates that during the COVID pandemic, where most Indians suffered terribly, Indian billionaires saw the wealth increase by more than double. And that tells you in a fundamental sense of the economic interests which really underlie this particular regime itself. And the final part I go to is titled "What is to be done." Again, I'm not saying what is to be done in terms of what my ideas on what is to be done now, but I'm trying to put together narratives of what can be done, looking at both contemporary examples as well as historical analogies. I just want to make a couple of quick points on this and wind up. That is, firstly, the idea of the defense of the normative state of the constitutional state is absolutely fundamental. The idea of liberty, equality, dignity, fraternity. We have to go back to the roots of those ideas, not look at them as texts, as empty words in the Constitution, but see them as the embodiment of certain kind of concrete historical struggle. And how do we defend the struggle and the language which the struggle today embodies? How do we defend the idea of an inclusive nationalism, which goes back in a sense to the ideas of Tagore? Uh, and and the idea of the father of the national anthem being in some sense also critical nationalism. How do you get forward that sentiment, which says nationalism is really about a love of the place, a love of people? It's not exclusive, but inclusive. How do you then also talk about the question of addressing inequality? Because again, you look at the rise of these kind of regimes around the world. India is not an exception. And the reason for that, again, Piketty's analysis, I don't have time to go into this, but his analysis is that when you have a rising levels of inequality, it allows for the growth of fascism, or growth of these kinds of forces, authoritarian forces. Final point which I make, and I'll end with this now, is that one part of the way forward, again, going back to one of the thinkers I rely upon a lot, is Hannah Arendt in her Origins of Totalitarianism. She says that, talks about what is a totalitarian regime really based on? What is the psychological basis of it? And she says two things. One is it's based on capitalizing on a sense of loneliness. What does she mean by loneliness? Loneliness is not solitude. Solitude is when you have a relationship with yourself. Loneliness is a space where you fundamentally can't connect to the world at all. That you're atomized, you're disempowered, and you feel alienated from the world at large. And in particular, if you look at global capitalism, one of the impacts it produces, as far as people are concerned, is a sense of alienation from themselves. And how do you address that sense of alienation? How do you address that sense of loneliness? Is a question that she's asking. What are the forms of society you encourage? What are the forms of belonging you encourage, which give people an alternative to what the right wing offers people? The second point she makes is the question of isolation. Again, what is isolation? She says isolation is a state where you fundamentally believe that you're alone in the world and nothing you do will change the status quo in any fashion or the other. And here, going back to Arendt, the point that she makes is the fundamental success of the Nazis was to destroy the moral person in man, was to make people believe that a protest has no historic significance. And she says that's when the night falls on the future. So our imperative in every way is to break that sense of isolation, for people to come together in larger and larger groups and associations and communities and challenge, in a sense, a regime which has a fundamental inability to tolerate or to live with diversity, which is really the heart of the Indian social, legal, and the constitutional order. The one okay, I keep saying one last point, but this is absolutely the last point. I want to stop with this. Is that the other part of the book which I try and do is I try and draw out, in a sense, the minority voices or the marginalized voices which are there, like the Kashmir Singh example which I narrated a little earlier. It could be the example of voices which are often forgotten, and try and pull them out and say that, in very difficult circumstances, people have spoken out. So we should not allow that to be holes of oblivion, as it were, because if the holes of oblivion, both hope disappears, struggle disappears, and resistance disappears. And cultivating hope and a spirit of resistance is really about telling these other stories. So do you realize that even in the most difficult circumstances, people are always spoken up. And it's an imperative today to continue the tradition and to keep speaking up. I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Arvin, for that brilliant sharing of sections of the book. I would now request Professor Ram Guha to respond to the book itself. Over to you.
Hi. Thank you, Bhargavi and Leo, for organizing this, and congratulations, Arvin, on your wonderful book, which I had the privilege of reading in manuscript. And it's a tour de force. I'll come to the book in a minute. But first of all, I think I noticed on the wall behind you the bound volumes of the Constituent Assembly debates. I noticed some other things also which I won't comment on, some other nice things which I won't comment on. But I was delighted to see the bound volumes of the Constituent Assembly debates. And those of you, especially young students here, and law students and people who are not law students, I urge you, when you have a month spare, to read them from end to end, not cherry pick from them. They're also online in various sites. It's very much nicer to read them the way Arvin has. And I read those debates while writing India After Gandhi. There's a chapter on the making of the Constitution, and that was almost 20 years ago. And one of my remaining ambitions is to read them again once slowly before I die, to digest them even better. So I think behind the spirit of Arvin's book is those intense, engaging and consequential debates that led to the framing of the Constitution. Now, Arvind's book does a brilliant job of investigating, analyzing, and critiquing the present. I'll come to the past a little later, and then I'll end with the future. But I want to talk about what, in my view, is Arvind's the best parts of Arvind's book. All parts are well worth reading and lots of interesting insights. It's Chapter 3, the Undeclared Emergency, which is also the title of the book. I think chapters 3 and 4, the Modi era, the Undeclared Emergency, and slouching towards a totalitarian future. So I think what Arvind has done superbly is to examine the origins of what he calls the prerogative state, the different laws, UAPA, and so on, and of course the NIA. Look at how they were formulated, what they seek to do. He talked in his presentation, he talked about one of the targets being activists, Dalit activists, and those working in tribal areas. I'll add to that a supplementary comment that this is particularly important to the current regime because one of his key funders is involved, several of his key funders are involved in mining. And the most lucrative mines are in Adivasi areas, and the jailing of activists like Stan Swamy and activist lawyers like Sudha Bhardwaj is crucial to suppressing the voice of those Adivasis protesting the takeover of their lands and forests and shrines by mining interests close to this government. So I think there is a political element to these laws, which is finding ways of crushing dissent, consolidating the control of the ruling party over the legal apparatus, not just the apparatus of administration. There's a political intent. There's an ideological intent, because essentially these guys don't believe in democracy. The RSS, let us not forget, opposed the granting of universal adult franchise. They were opposed to the first general election, the granting of universal adult franchise. And finally, there's a material economic interest too. And I think that sometimes doesn't clearly come out. But Sudha Bhardwaj, the arrest of Sudha Bhardwaj, Mahesh Raut, and the late and much mourned Father Swamy, as 3 of the 16, I think is directly traced to the mining lobby, in my view. I mean, obviously, it would be not easy to document every step, but there seems to be a clear connection. Now, so I think Arvind's analysis of these laws is fantastic. And also his analysis of why they aren't struck down by the highest courts. I think he's, as a trained lawyer, as a legal scholar, his critique of the Indian judiciary and its higher judiciary particularly, and the parallels he draws with the emergency when there was an abdication of constitutional duties by the highest court. I was also struck by what he said about the high courts during the emergency, who were relatively more bold and progressive than the Supreme Court. And we've had some high courts here who have played a similar role, but the state is alert to the state is alert to that possibility. And if you look at the pattern of transfers and appointments of High Court judges, for example, and High Court Chief Justices, the recent transfer of the Madras High Court Chief Justice, the denial of a posting to a major High Court to Justice Qureshi, who is now in Tripura, and so on. You can see, I think, that the current rulers know that even if the Supreme Court is largely on your side, even if the Supreme Court is timid, complicit may be too harsh a word, but timid and laggard, certainly, the fact that they haven't heard the Kashmir cases for more than 2 years, or the electoral bonds case either. So they may, the High Court allows open spaces. Some High Courts allow open spaces, which must also be controlled and suppressed and extinguished. So I think that's the analysis of anti-constitutional laws and the failures of our judicial system to act as a corrective to the framing, enactment, and enforcement of bad laws, I think are critical contributions of Arvin's book. They very illuminating and important contributions of Arvin's book. Likewise, his analysis of pauper resistance. And I'm glad he also went into not just street protest, but also the realm of music and folklore through his section, for example, on the Kabir Kalamat. And I think that sort of resistance, which is cuts across the social spectrum, is not just non-violent, but often joyful. I mean, maybe the farmers' protest came too late for Arvin to take full account of in his book. But if you look at the farmers' protest and the poetry and music and posters they generated, right, I think is something, it was in that sense a sequel to the anti-CAA protest. So I think Arvin's analysis of the present is, I think, absolutely superb. So is his analysis of the past, but I want to say something about the past. I want to, he has a chapter on the emergency, I think it's chapter 2, which is a close analysis, a close legal and political analysis of the emergency, authoritarian rule, the emergency of 75-77, and then a special chapter on preventive detention, which he's talked about. Now, I think Babu and I are the only two panelists who remember the emergency. I think Babu probably much better than me. I was a college student when the emergency was imposed. I think Babu was older than me and Babu was an activist. I was a student. But I had, I would say, the advantage, but I was based in Delhi. So I was kind of in a university student right when all this was happening. And much later, I studied it as a historian and wrote about it in a chapter, actually in 2 chapters of India after Gandhi. And I want to say something about inspired, provoked by Arvin's analysis, something about the undeclared emergency of today in relation to the declared emergency of 1975-77. And I want to speak about what I see as a historian and as someone who has seen both emergencies at first hand, what I see as the parallels and the departures. I think Arvind has spoken a lot about the parallels, not so much about the departures, so I'll say a little bit about the departures, but on the parallels, one additional point to what Arvind talked about is the cult of personality. That's a striking parallel between Indira Gandhi's regime and Narendra Modi's regime. It is the fusion of leader, party, government, and nation. Indira Gandhi was the Congress, was the government of India, was the Republic of India. And similarly with Modi. There's another parallel, which I actually wrote about as early in 2016 in the Telegraph, which is that you can see Amit Shah as a sort of Sanjay Gandhi. The only person whom the leader trusts, is actually ruthless and instrumental in the acquisition of power and the suppression of dissent. And of course, Sanjay Gandhi would have joined the cabinet had he not died in that air crash. Right? So I think apart from the ruthlessness, the immorality, the capture of the administrative bureaucratic system, the taming of the judiciary and of the media, there is the cult of personality. And I think I disagree with what Arvin said slightly, having lived through it. Actually, Indira Gandhi was very popular in many parts of India. She still retained all of South India. I think it's the reverse with Modi. Modi is much more popular in North India today than he is in North India, than he is in South India. So I think parallels are striking, but there are also some departures. And I'd like to alert the audience to the departures. Some of the departures are heartening. So I'll talk about them first. Some of the departures are depressing. One major difference between the emergency and the what you're calling the undeclared emergency is during the period of 1975-77, Indira Gandhi and the Congress party controlled virtually all of India except Tamil Nadu, which also then capitulated. Now that is not the case. Large swathes of the subcontinent of the Republic, including some major states, 4 out of 5 southern states, Bengal, Orissa, Punjab, Chhattisgarh, are outside the realm of the BJP. So in that sense, there's a far greater geographical, demographic, social, political space available, which cannot be totally controlled by the state apparatus. They would like to, like shifting, centralized attacks on federalism, shifting cases, the Supreme Court consolidating cases, the prerogative given to the NIA and UAPA to go anywhere. The way, for example, when Disha Ravi was arrested, the Karnataka police even did not know. So clearly, this is a problem for the Modi Shah regime, that so much of India is outside their formal political control. Right. Now, this is something which is a difference from the emergency. The second difference is that the press is not completely suppressed. During the emergency, there was absolutely no possibility of expressing your views like we are today, or like some brave independent websites are doing, because the press was totally controlled and censored. Today, it is largely controlled, largely subservient, but there are still some open spaces for creative thinking and reportage, by brave, independent-minded journalists and reporters. So those are the two heartening, modestly heartening departures. But there are two depressing departures, two ways in which the current situation differs quite substantially, which should worry us. The first, Arvind has already talked about, which is the creeping majoritarianism and how the hateful philosophy, I won't call it a philosophy, the hateful and poisonous ideology, or I would call it pathology of Hindutva, has entered the minds of so many ordinary Indians, and they're convinced by it. Indira Gandhi was an authoritarian, but she was not a majoritarian. Now you have a combination of that, and that seems to have had some substantial popular success. So that is the worrying departure. The second worrying departure, and I'll say it absolutely bluntly, and I think I can be blunt and polemical. And the second departure is this: Rahul Gandhi is not Jayaprakash Narayan. Nor is Priyanka Gandhi either, by the way. And nor indeed, having said that, would be Mamata Banerjee or Arvind Kejriwal. So a figure of charisma, credibility, integrity, with a heroic political past, unsullied by any kind, with a vision, unsullied by any kind of, family association or corruption, is not there. And I think in one of the consequences of, let me go back. Indian politics was always greatly influenced by personalities, and it's not an accident that Ambedkar warned us in his last speech on the Constituent Assembly about the cult of personality. Personalities are very important in Indian politics, and even more so in the age of social media and WhatsApp. So you would have to have, you can have many movements, but the lack of a unifying figure around how people can, cohere, I think could probably is a disadvantage to those who want to restore the democratic fabric of this country. That was the past, and the parallels and the departures between today's undeclared emergency and the declared emergency of the 1970s. The last thing I'd like to say is about the future. Now, I don't want to say any more about, I've written enough about and said enough about and expressed myself about the word is contempt I have for the Gandhi family and the Congress party. I mean, I have nothing but contempt, and I think they are Modi's greatest accomplices. But I think I want to say a little bit about what has happened after Amit Shah entered the cabinet. I think 2019 is a critical moment in the transformation of the Indian political order, as Arvin documents in his book, but also in the transformation of the BJP. Leo, in his introductory remarks, recalled 19 December 2019. And he said, I'm quoting what he said, the Bangalore police finally were forced to be restrained and they had to arrest thousands of people. They respected democracy. Now, that was the Bangalore police of December 2019. That was the Bangalore police under a chief minister who occasionally felt some shame. Who was the last representative of Vajpayee's BJP, Yediyurappa. I mean, Yediyurappa, has a very shady personal record, but on some matters, he can respond to people's instincts, and it is said about him jokingly that he's a typical congressman, secular and nepotistic, and making deals now. So that is, if you look at the transformation of BJP, then not just Yediyurappa going, but the rise of Adityanath and the transformation of Mumbai. I mean, if you look at the attacks on Christians, the anti-conversion laws, this not just mad but dangerous idea that the politics will be oriented around the construction of a statue of Hanuman and a Sanskrit university and so on. So essentially, the BJP has been transformed from a party with the occasional genuflection to democratic process, to human rights, to interfaith relations, to one that is absolutely hardcore authoritarian and majoritarian. And I think that is why, I'll come to my last point. Given this transformation of the BJP, I think it's very important that there is a political vehicle to combat them. Arvin's book spends a great deal of time analyzing popular resistance movements, and his subtitle is Constitutionalism and the Politics of Resistance. And while reading Arvin's book, I was reminded of another excellent book, thought-provoking and very interesting book I read just before the pandemic, around the time the pandemic started. This is a book some of you will know, but I would recommend it along with Arvin's book. It is Yogendra Yadav's essay collection, Making Sense of Democracy, Making Sense of Indian Democracy. And I wrote a long review essay in The Wire about that book. And I think students particularly would like to read Arvind's analysis as a legal scholar alongside Yogendra Yadav's analysis as a political scientist of the there's some very interesting points of congruence, and I think they kind of complement each other. Now, in his book, I'm quoting from my review, Yogendra Yadav in his book, I say, places less hope in opposition parties and greater trust in what is called the non-party political process. He focuses in particular on the hope and possibility of farmers and youth movements. And so he writes, I quote, this is a quote from Yogendra Yadav, the electoral arena may not be central to the historic mission of reclaiming the republic. I repeat, the electoral arena may not be central to the historic mission of reclaiming the republic. We are unlikely to witness a repeat of 1977, when an authoritarian ruler quietly stepped down after an electoral defeat. Mass mobilization and popular resistance outside the electoral arena are going to be prerequisites for any effective reversal of the hegemonic power. Now, Arvin is not so explicit in his conclusions, but some of his analysis tends towards this. And like them, I admire the youth movement, the farmers movement, the anti-CA movements. I think they had enormous resilience and energy and revitalized Indian democracy and gave all of us hope and succor in very difficult times. And the pandemic, of course, killed it. But the farmers movement showed how even in the pandemic you could protest. But I would offer a word of caution to this audience, and I did that in print to my friend Yogendra Yadav, is that while I don't dispute the need for an importance of popular movements, always non-violent, I think this regime in the end will have to be defeated at the ballot box. So let us not discount the importance of finding ways of renewing a viable political electoral opposition. If you look, for example, at the history of the judiciary, it was the defeat of Indira Gandhi that led to a revival, that led to a bolstering of the spine of the judiciary. It was the renewal of federalism came after the electoral defeat of Indira Gandhi. Attempts to assert the freedom of the press came after the defeat of Indira Gandhi electorally. A sense of relative independence among the civil service also was a consequence of the electoral defeat of the first authoritarian regime. So the last point I'll make when you look towards the future, what is to be done is that popular non-party movements are admirable, to be supported, but ultimately, if you want to reverse, if you want to restore constitutionalism in India in its broadest sense, I think this regime will have to be defeated at the ballot box. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Guha. Without wasting much time, I will now request Madhu Bhushan to respond, followed by Professor Babu Matthew. Over to you, Madhu.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bhargavi. And thank you, ESG, PUCL, Manthan Law, and Westland Books for organizing this, this meeting, especially on Republic Day, and asking me to be part of the conversation. I think the context and importance of this book is very evident, as laid out by Leo and as spoken about by Arvin himself and Ram Guha, who has taken it, further. I'm most happy to be here, even if I feel a little out of place amidst all the luminaries here, because Arvind is a dear old friend and fellow traveler. And we have had a history of spending hours in heated debate on a range of issues, but primarily one on the institution of, on the issue of constitution versus culture. I bring a little of this debate here, only because it echoes through the book, and especially the very last Leninist chapter, What is to be done, that holds special interest for me. And I'm glad that, both Arvind and Ram have gone through the earlier chapters in pretty much a lot of detail. So that leaves me, so I would like to focus more on the last chapter, which Arvind himself says that advice that I should pay attention to and respond, which suited me. You see, the Constitution is obviously, Arvind's Karma Bhumi, and mine has been communities. That's the work that I do. And the communities, not only communities, but the cultures and individuals who constitute it. So our positions have been fairly clear, Arvind's and mine. His was, as Ambedkar had rightly said, that democracy is only the topsoil on an Indian culture that is inherently undemocratic. And so the Constitution is, Constitution and law is the key to not only hold the state accountable, but also bring about any social and political transformation. And from my experience, or from the experience of me and all my colleagues in the women's movement that I've been part of, is that the law and constitution are mere pieces of paper that have little to do with life, and we need to delve more deeply into the endless possibilities of engaging with individual lives, like that of women survivors of violence, and living cultures, who are also addressing issues of resistance and issues of justice, violence, and peace in their everyday lives. Now, surprisingly, or perhaps not so surprisingly, in recent years, I guess both of us have not only mellowed, but moved in our positions. And now, quite shockingly, we find ourselves agreeing with each other most of the time. And so here I am agreeing very enthusiastically, and of course, it's inevitable, I think, on the need to use the legal and human rights discourse and instruments to address especially the growing might of this totalitarian state. And he, on the other hand, most enthusiastically and in a special and intense way, is exploring the language, the multiple languages of resistance in cultures and communities to challenge the totalitarian regime, which is what is there in this final chapter of his. In fact, on another note, it was really on his insistence that I even read Parva, S.L. Bhairappa's Parva, despite my disquiet about, his misogyny, and moved to the right. And I'm glad I did, because it opened up so many subversive ways of reading the Mahabharata, which cannot be reduced to one written text that defines Hinduism, but a multiplicity of readings that defy this oneness of Hindutva, the pathology of Hindutva, as Ram called it. So here I am reading and responding to this book on constitutionalism and the politics of resistance, which echoes so much of what I have felt and never been able to express half as eloquently as Arvind has. Because when I was reading the book and I kept flipping the pages, especially of the last chapter, it was incredible the way in which it was like he was anticipating and responding to every argument I was, mentally gearing up to make. So now, to just wind up this part of my sharing of our dialogue and our debates, I just would like to acknowledge that Arvind is primarily responsible for my conversion to a reluctant constitutionalist. For you all know that as an obsessive constitutionalist, he is supremely persuasive, especially when he speaks about it more with the passion of a poet and curiosity of a philosopher rather than the dry logic of a lawyer. And this book is a testimony to that, despite the fact that it is addressing an issue that is as terrifyingly cold as the undeclared state of emergency that we are undoubtedly living in. So congratulations and thank you, Arvind, for this, as Kavita Krishnan calls it, a very illuminating and inspiring book. We might be living in what seems to be absolutely dark times, but this book not only bears witness to the darkness of these times and helps us in understanding it, but it manages to illuminate the way ahead with some little sparks of resistance and hope drawn from a multiplicity of sources that range from the Constitution and Ambedkar to Hannah Arendt, whom you quote so extensively, who is one of the most profound thinkers on the structures and politics of fascism, to Gandhi and Tagore, who spoke most poetically about the possibilities of inclusive nationalisms and cultures, and all of who together, there are many, many names, there are many, many people whom you weave into this resistance chapter, all of them offer some hope that we can overcome and outlive this totalitarian state in ways that we could not have otherwise imagined. So now, in the spirit of taking forward this ongoing debate with Arvind, I'd like to respond from my perspective to some of the fascinating ideas I found in his book. Of course, one being the difference he makes between the authoritarian and the totalitarian state, and the other on trying to go beyond the monolith of the one state to understand its duality in terms of what he calls the prerogative state and the normative state. And if I understand it right, Arvind, you can please correct me if I'm wrong, the prerogative state being the dominant state and the normative state being that which resists the dominance of the former, even while being part of it. So I'll start with this. I'll start with the second one, which is the normative and prerogative state, and use this framing, this particular very interesting framing that he has done, to talk about the duality of culture, which in terms of normative and prerogative cultures. For culture too, like the state, is not hegemonic, but dualistic and even multidimensional, as many of the people that he refers to in his chapter have repeatedly said, including Bal Gopal or Hannah Arendt or Martha, whom he's quoting extensively. So now, where do I come from? As I said, my karma bhumi has largely been the women's movement and our everyday work with issues related to everyday violence against women and marginalized communities, and their everyday world that we have learned much from. The primary lesson being that we cannot look at them only as victims, survivors, or resistors of violence, but as active agents with their own understandings of oppression and liberation, however micro it might be. And we believe that it is these micro worlds and these processes that should inform and feed our understanding of both the macro world and the politics and our own responses to it. For as we say, like a mantra in the women's movement constantly, the personal is the political. And this is something that gets reinforced time and again, even when we're looking at something as large and political as state accountability and culpability, as Arvind is doing in this book. And this is not an understanding that we came to easily, just to share a little bit of our own experience. This is not something we came to easily. For in the early days of the women's movement in the 1780s, we also outright rejected culture and the various social institutions it had spawned. Saying, as perhaps Ambedkar did, that culture is essentially patriarchal, and therefore it cannot and will not provide us with any solutions that should come from the more neutral state and its institutions like the law and the judiciary. Now, drawing upon this, we asked for changes in laws and policies that we thought will be our primary instruments for gender equality and a violence-free world. But obviously, this led to a huge disappointments, because despite all the fairly decent laws we got, whether it was related to sexual violence, domestic violence, or property rights, violence and discrimination really did not disappear. It only reappeared in more updated forms. For patriarchy is rather durable and resilient. It is amoebic. It morphs and adapts to every new social and ideological formation, from feudalism to socialism to communism to capitalism. And what we had not appreciated perhaps at that time was that while patriarchy is inherently it's inherent in prerogative cultures that hegemonize and homogenize, there were also normative cultures that are constantly challenging and subverting it with their larger and more holistic understanding of morality and human values. Now, I'm speaking a little outside, what Arvind has actually stated, but as I said, I'm dialoguing with what he said. So over the years, we have not only attempted to understand the context and contours of patriarchy, class, caste for us, which is the prerogative state, but also how it has been countered by the normative state. And the one-size-fits-all of a state-induced top-down notion of change as through laws is neither sustainable nor feasible or desirable. Women in our experience were refusing to be liberated from their patriarchal powers, despite all the feminist utopias that we were offering them through individual autonomy and freedom promised by the laws and constitution. And so began the hard task of listening to and engaging with every woman in her own context and culture. And that meant we began to engage with all those networks of relationships and identities that defined her as much as being a woman did. And that meant that we began to pay more attention to what she defined as oppression and what she desired as liberation from that. And that meant engaging with normative cultures with all their seeming contradictions and political incorrectness. Now, there are many stories that I have. Perhaps I'll come back to that later, of how this really revealed itself, how these normative cultures really helped to confront and challenge these prerogative cultures, as I've been saying. But of course, to come back to Arvind's book, the need to directly challenge state hegemony is also essential. It's absolutely essential to do the kind of human rights lawyering that Arvind speaks about in his earlier chapters. And he brings in a lot of examples from South Africa, Israel, and of course, India, and closer home to Karnataka, where the kind of work done by our friends like Clifton, Maitreyi, Afif, and all the others from Manthan and ALF during the COVID crisis was just fantastic. And it also reminded me of the insistent and thankless feminist lawyering done by lawyers like, of course, Brinda, Rebecca John, Indra Jaising, Flavia Agnes, Aarti Munpur, and Maitreyi, who was slow, and so many others who are slowly chipping away at the patriarchal state and society, along with the women who dare to stand up and fight the system from within their homes and communities, be it Bhavari Devi, Mathura, or Ramizabi, or Shabanu in the past. And in more recent years, the nuns in Kerala who have stood up against the might of the church, or Hadia in Kerala, and or the young women in Udupi, the young students in Udupi who have stood up against the might of Hindutva. And while doing this, I want to remember. I think in this context, I'd like to remember that what Vrinda has said in the case of the nuns, and which echoes and what Clifton and all have been doing in the courts here, is that let us not forget that verdicts are not the only victories. As a new day dawns, let us remember that the decision to fight for justice and stay persistent in victory, and stay persistent, is victory itself. And so this brings me to the second point of the authoritarian and totalitarian state, of how we understand their specific politics within which they're embedded, but also how we understand the continuities if we have to evolve long-term sustainable strategies to resist and challenge this kind of totalitarianism. I think what Arvind has done, which as Ram has also pointed out, in pointing out laying out the core difference between this authoritarian state in categorizing, you know, that the emergency was embedded in an authoritarian state, and the current state of undeclared emergency is embedded in a totalitarian state. I think this is it's a very insightful and brilliant formulation. It's a wonderful way of understanding what we are confronted with. For all too easily, we make these easy and flippant connections between the earlier emergency and that which we are faced with now, which is in fact far more dangerous and insidious and total. But however, as I was also talking to Arvind, I think we also need to understand or to conceptualize what was the kind of state that existed between the earlier state, the authoritarian state, and the totalitarian state of today, because it's not as if the totalitarian state, you know, just came in a vacuum, because it was this period between the emergency and what happened post 90s that the foundations were laid for a totalitarian state. And to put it in terms of realpolitik, much as today, Congress seems to be the only national alternative to BJP, and notwithstanding the possibilities posed by the various regional parties in terms of federalism, the fact is that this period, it did lay the foundations for the ills that we are dying with today, be it the UAPA, which Arvind has gone into extensively, which is in the book that is today being deployed, particularly against Muslims, minorities, and other anti-national activists, or the corporate policy or the corporate policies that laid the foundation for the criminalization and the annihilation of the poor in the name of development and progress. And I don't think we can ever forget that Operation Green. We can't forget Operation Green Hunt. And Chidambaram's statement that he is willing to tolerate any dissent as long as it doesn't affect the 8% GDP India had at that time. So I do think it is absolutely essential to understand what happened between these two emergencies, which was in fact the opening up of the doors to global capital. And that perhaps was not so by a not so unhappy coincidence, it happened along with the opening of the doors of the Ram Temple and the demolition of the Babri Masjid. For capitalism, which I think Arvind has also spoken about in the book, is what has also bred and given fuel to the monster of cultural fundamentalism, which has taken the shape of Hindutva, notwithstanding the fact that Hindutva or extreme Hinduism has been around for a considerable amount of time, but like many other evils had existed but being kept in check. Now, there is little doubt that in this context of capital and communalization, the prerogative state and prerogative culture have come together in ways that they have never done before, giving rise to the kind of totalitarian violence we see around us. Like Ram said, there's a huge groundswell of support, for Hindutva. People believe in it, unlike, a support for the authoritarianism of Indira Gandhi. And that, for me, is the most dangerous aspect of today's emergency. And we must not ignore the fact that this is a kind of totalitarian violence that is rooted in economic and cultural fundamentalism that has made deep inroads into our lives, reshaping all institutions, be that of the family and community. So coming back to my point about the micro world, constantly moving with the micro and the macro, to micro world of women, because we see that in the midst of all this, nothing much has changed for the women. For a notion of patriarchal power continues to underlie every form of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Indira Gandhi was revered as the only man in the cabinet, despite the fact that the BJP in Vajpayee's time lauded her as, Ma Durga. And we cannot forget, of course, the 56-inch, who's ruling us, or the current Minister for Higher Education, who said that he is a man, who declared in public that he's a man, and that the BJP is a manly party, and that it will take on the masculine challenge of constructing the Mekedatu Dam, dams and masculinity. I think the symbolism is unmistakable. So most women, especially from the marginalized communities, have lived and continue to live in permanent states of emergency, with their liberties, dignity, equality, and fraternity constantly compromised, be it their right to free speech, their right to address or food of their choice, their right to profession, or their right to love and have relationships. Their lives are constantly policed and constantly under surveillance, be it by a state that resides inside their homes or heads, or rules them as citizens. And the prerogative state, of course, chooses to target some categories of women at specific points of time, as today it is targeting the Muslim women, or like the prerogative culture targets Dalit women, or even sex workers, where the target both of a prerogative state and prerogative culture. Now, in this book, Arvind, he talks about building a united front against totalitarianism. Yes, we do need to mobilize against the spectrum, again, across the spectrum against the current regime. But what have we learned, what we have learned on this journey of resistance, while dealing with this micro-authoritarianism and totalitarianism within homes and within women's lives, is that we must also do so, we must resist this, we must build this united front against totalitarianism. We must do so knowing that the enemy cannot always be externalized, and nor can he be reduced to the one. And so the resistance must be plural. Again, many of the writers, thinkers, philosophers who Arvind has quoted in his chapter refer to this, in different ways. Because, and I think that the reason, and which as many of them say, is that why do we need to not externalize, and why should we not reduce the enemy to the one or an external enemy? It's because it is the opposite of what totalitarianism does, because that is exactly what totalitarianism does. It creates the one external target or the enemy, be it Pakistan or the Naxal or the terrorist or the anti-national. We know the script. We need to also challenge and break the script of dualism and dichotomy. Like women who not only challenge patriarchies within their own home and community, but also that of the state. Because like I said, they're living with totalitarianism and emergency on an everyday basis. And therefore, their modes of protest too are multiple, sometimes collective, sometimes individual. And there must be the space for both. And this echoes with something of what Hannah Arendt says, and Arvind quotes her, where she says that the Achilles heel of totalitarian evil was the being it sought to completely transform, the being Homo sapiens, of people itself. That is what totalitarian tries to do, that is what totalitarian evil tries to do. It seeks to transform the individual. But the fact is that one can never predict, the way in which each person would respond under given such conditions, because the human race, as she says, is infinitely plural. And as she says very rightly, as long as people were born and inhabited the earth, their capacity to break out of totalitarian conditions and to create a world worthy of plural human beings could not be eliminated. To just give you an example, this kind of set me thinking about the, at the height of the COVID crisis last year, now 2 years back, when we were doing a lot of the, relief and especially at the time of the migrant crisis, when there was exceptional human rights lawyering done by our friends to get which was an act of the normative state, pushing the prerogative state to really to speak on behalf of the people and to get justice for the migrants and others who were hit by the lockdown. We had, huge armies of volunteers, so this was in fact the normative culture in action. This was not kind of the state telling or the court telling, but this was really, it was huge numbers of people, volunteers who had come out to really to give relief, to the migrants and to those who had been impacted by the lockdown. It was very, very spontaneous, and in that, of course, it was a Muslim community that played a very, very central role. And And I'll never forget the story of one volunteer, and that time it was, of course, thanks to the state that had demonized Muslims. And in the context of COVID too, and said, it was a Tablighi, they called it the Tablighi virus. In fact, it was a demonization of the virus apart from the community. So the Muslim volunteers were facing a lot of difficulties, when they were going around to give relief and distribution, because they were, in fact, many of them were even sent back saying, we don't accept, relief from Muslims. It was that bad, but they continued, disregarding that kind of hate that they were confronted with. They just went about doing what they believed that they should be doing. And in one incident, there was this young man who was approached, because it was in an area where nobody could access. So he was approached by some local RSS workers to give food to a priest's family. And this young man, he called up this family, and he told them, he said that, listen, I am a Muslim, I'm from the Muslim community. So would it be okay if I came and delivered relief to you? And the priest family responded saying, how can we say no? We are in need, and you are there, to come and give us this relief as a savior. And it does not matter what you are. Now, these are, of course, there may be few moments here, and perhaps far between, but I would like to think that there are more of these moments. And in this connection, I want to quote what Arvin says of Bal Gopal, what Bal Gopal says, who is a quintessential human rights activist philosopher, who points out for the need for a strategy. It's a strategy of resistance, right? So he falls out the need for a strategy that is founded not on opposition alone, but on what he calls moral values, on how he feels the need to build democratic tolerance and the acceptance of social equality as a principle, and appeal to the sense of justice that human cultures equally possess. What I draw from all this is perhaps that what is needed is not just, it's not enough just to have this one glorious revolution that will overthrow this regime. And as Ram says, perhaps it's only the election that will do that, because I don't think any other revolution is possible. I think it can only happen through the ballot. But in the meantime, that is not enough. That is not sufficient to really root out the culture of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. That is deep within us. And so what we need to do is to really nurture 1,000 such invisible revolutions of love and solidarity that will erode the legitimacy and roots of this one totalitarian entity. And so when the edifice falls, as we hope it will not only be because of this one action of elections, but also because it has been weakened and eroded within by these 1,000 revolutions that will not only challenge its moral and ethical might, but also put into place a sense of justice that all human cultures equally possess. And we must believe that. Laying the ground, therefore, for, as Bal Gopal says, a radical political practice which stresses on cultivating qualities such as empathy and love. And love was never considered of any political value, and that it has been brought to the center stage to our worldview of resistance is as much thanks to philosophers like political philosophers like Bal Gopal and Hannah Arendt and Martha Hasselbaum, as it is like our old bhakti poets like Mirabai or Akka Mahadevi, who in their time, when they resisted authority, and they resisted authority through love or surrender to a higher power that they personally embraced despite what it cost them. And finally, I hope I'm not taking too much time. Arvin speaks very poignantly, and today also he spoke about it. He speaks very poignantly about isolation and loneliness as a psychological states on which totalitarianism thrives. Now, this kind of isolation and cultural alienation is also at the heart of capitalism. A rootless alienation that is the fodder of fundamentalism of all kinds, be it cultural, religious, or political. How can one counter this atomized, isolated, competitive, aggressive, macho, individual who is at the height of capital? I think, as again, Martha Nussbaum, she gives us an answer when she speaks in terms of a notion of human rights that would include a return to public poetry of humanity that would use art, emotion, and the humanities to craft a pluralistic public culture. And I think, again, as Ram stated, I think we saw this we saw this pluralistic public culture on display in two recent protests, which is a farmers' protest and the anti-CAA protest, which are two examples of the biggest and the most spectacular and perhaps the most peaceful protests in recent history. And this is an example, I would say, as a public poetry of humanity, and also a threat to the rootless and alienated individualism of capitalism, because these were not mere protests against the state. It was not mere protests against the state, but they were community satyagrahas. They were celebrations of cultural and political solidarity. And again, it's not a coincidence. I'm sorry if I keep harking back to this, but it's not a coincidence that at the heart of this celebration of dissent were the women who were protesting against the policies of the government by bringing their private lives onto the streets. So the streets were a celebration of private lives of women and of communities. The streets became schools. The streets became spaces where women sat and spoke. It became spaces where there was cooking. It became spaces where they were, singing songs. It became spaces where they were stitching. They were doing all kinds of non-political activity apart from speaking out against the politics of the government. And I think this is what nurtures an alternative solidarity, even as you are, as we are speaking out against the totalitarian state. So thank you, Arvin. I think I will end here. Thank you, Arvin, for introducing all of us to this incredible world of poets, philosophers, and activists who have not only reminded us about how human beings have resisted oppression in history, as you said, but have done so by finding the roots of a defiant love. A love that liberates at the individual level and unites at the collective level. And I will end with one of our favorite poets, Akkama Devi, one of the greatest Veerashaiva poets, who walked out of her marriage with a local king, renounced worldly life, and declared her lover openly to be Shiva, and shed her clothes and social hypocrisies and challenged the status quo, and said, those who have become equal by love, should they need background or pretensions? Those who have gone mad, do they know shame or restraint? Those who are loved by the lovely Lord of Jasmines, could they have loyalty to the world? You can confiscate the riches of the land, but can you confiscate the riches of the body? You can rip off all clothing and ornaments from the body, but can you rip off the bliss that covers and veils me? O fool, what is the need of clothing and ornaments for the shameless woman who is clad in the light of the divine, lovely Lord of the Jasmines? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Madhu, for that fantastic, thought-provoking sharing of your thoughts about the book and the content of the book and so much more. Our last speaker for the day is Professor Babu Matthew. Over to you, Professor Babu, and soon after your presentation, we'll take in a few questions.
Thank you, ESG, Bhargavi, Leo, for bringing all of us together. It's a very timely initiative. And I'm so happy that Arvin's book, has come out in good time. When there is a lot of question about what is the way forward, I think Arvin's book offers some answers, especially in terms of the inability, even at the level of the political front, which Ramchandra Guha was referring to, as to how there can be greater unity on the electoral front. I think even for that purpose, Arvin's analysis will be useful, and I hope it will reach every political party also. At the very outset, I must express tremendous happiness at the fact that Arvind has been my student of the National Law School, and I've had opportunity to work with him more as a colleague than as a student through several stages. And this also reminds me that the law school has produced quite a few excellent constitutional scholars. Arvind referred to one of them, that is Tarunab Gaithan. And I want to remember something which he was telling us on his last visit to the Law University. And that is, he was saying that the average life of a constitution at a world level is 17 years. And the Indian constitution has lasted this great length. And, trying to search for an answer, why has this happened? One reason which Taruna also gave was that so much of consensus was involved in the process of drafting the constitution. And so for many reasons, it's not as if all those who played a leading role in our Constituent Assembly or in the independence movement. It's not correct, I think, to separate the independence movement from the Constituent Assembly, because after all, it was Gandhi who got us the independence, and I think very consciously decided to keep out of the Constituent Assembly, of course, because his first preference was to go to Naupoli and be in the midst of the calamity which was happening there. So, at least half a dozen constitutional law scholars have come out of the National Law School, and they have contributed, books and articles which are of tremendous value and significance for the present context. But I would pull out Arvin's latest book as belonging to a different category. And I think that is because of his long association with the LGBTQ community and the type of struggle which they have carried out, bringing together activism and legal challenge, from the Delhi High Court to the Supreme Court. So this is a dimension of scholarship which Arvind brings into constitutional law. And I think for other reasons also, especially in terms of his analysis of preventive detention. And both the preventive detention laws under emergency and preventive detention laws now, especially the latter, he has given us a very elaborate argument, which ordinary readers may not like very much. And that's the reason why the book must go into the law fraternity. Students of constitutional law must be exposed to this book. And I think that will be in keeping with, what is to be done. So that's an aspect which at the very outset, I want to, take note of. Another thing which comes to my mind as a result of Ram Guha's comment, yes, during the emergency, I was active. I was arrested from the Ashoka Hotel where we were having a general body meeting. And I was in the company of MC Narasimhan, who was very close to the chief minister at that time. So even before we reached the High Grounds police station, there was an order that we should be released. So I missed the opportunity of keeping company with others who were in custody for longer periods of time. I'm sure that would have had another kind of influence on my life. But what was more interesting was the best part of constitutional law that I learned was when the habeas corpus writ petitions were being argued in the Karnataka High Court. L.K. Advani and Madhu Bhushan and one more person from the old Congress, they were detained in the Bangalore jail. And their case came up before Justice D.M. Chandrasekhar. That is an extraordinary judge who would walk from his house to the High Court. He always wore khadar. He was dressed in white and white, and nobody would know that he was a High Court judge till he went and sat on the bench. And he gave a patient hearing, and the type of lawyers, the best of the legal fraternity from across India came to the Karnataka High Court. K.K. Venugopal was there in order to help his father, Nambiar, to argue the case. So also Santosh Hegde was there to carry the case law books into the court. And so it was a feast. And they, after great discussion, invoked the discussion whether is it a good idea to challenge the emergency on the ground that it was declared in a mala fide manner, that Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad acted in a mala fide manner. And so when that question came up, they decided that's not an easy argument to advance, and they identified Justice M.C. Chagla. Retired MC Justice Chagla came to the Bangalore High Court, and he actually tried out this argument. And so, in a sense, the fraternity among the lawyers cutting across all kinds of opinion was fantastic. And it was a hugely educative experience, that I had. I attended every single day of the hearing. And, Justice Chandrasekhar ordered a release of Advani and the others. And so technically, for the reason that if you quote 6 grounds on which they are to be detained, and it is found that 1 ground is not a valid ground, that is enough to demonstrate non-application of mind by the detaining authority. And therefore, he released them. So there was great joy, and they all came out of the High Court. As they stepped out of the High Court, they were arrested again with a fresh detention order and taken back to the same jail. So that was also the quality of emergency and its so-called respect for the judiciary. But otherwise, observations which Arvin makes later on in connection with the functioning of the High Court, I agree with. Yes, I think the backbone of Arvin's book is really the contrast that he makes between emergency under Indira Gandhi and the present undeclared emergency. It's a very nice point of entry in order to stimulate discussion among people. It's almost like the most common question that is asked when people come together, to have tea. Yenappa edu emergency tara ide alva. Then the answer is, how do it emergency ne? Somebody will say, illa like emergency already. So you see, it's a common question of common people has now reached a brilliant analysis. And I think this distinction between authoritarianism and totalitarianism is a very valuable thing which must get wider currency and be discussed, in much greater depth. I also like, since Arvin did not mention this point, I want to share it, and that is, Arvind is giving 6 reasons why authoritarianism is not the same as totalitarianism. And so looking at this, unique features of totalitarianism is very valuable for the current situation. And of course, the single most important reason is the fact that totalitarianism is supported by an ideology, and that there is the RSS behind it, and it enjoys popular support, and that the state literally uses mob power, or at least, gives them solid support in order to do what they want, and that Hindutva has started entering into the Indian legal regime. And apart from all that, the pro-corporate character. I feel that this pro-corporate character is something which Arvin may have to take up in another book. He already indicates the need for it, I think, when he's referring to Piketty towards the last chapter. And I think, in that context, let me, given the constraints of time, also mention, that the way in which you have recapitulated details of the emergency is a very good approach for a constitutional law class also. Nowadays, that kind of constitutional law teaching has disappeared. And therefore, as law people, I'm speaking of myself and Arvin, I think it is useful to take that approach among the student community. I particularly like the way in which he has focused upon A.K. Gopalan's case, and the fact that right from the beginning you had a judge like Justice Fazal Ali who pronounced and stuck to his dissenting judgment. And those are very important things which we must take repeatedly to the classroom. Above all, I like the fact that you bring in theory and you have, use Hannah Arendt's analysis in order to link it up with our local situation. And I think that's valuable. But let me now, like Madhu did, fall back on something connected with labor in order to look at this comparison that you have made between Indira's emergency and what the current government is doing. Let me see how quickly I can do that. But what I am going to try and indicate is the emergency was also a period during which many good pro-labor legislations came out. And they are quite far-reaching. And we must ask ourselves the question, why and how did that happen? And the one that comes foremost in my mind is the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act. That is 1976. And I must say, having looked at so many pieces of legislation over the last half a century, I would think this is one of the best among the lot. And that is because a sociological analysis of the Indian form of bonded labor being embedded in the caste system was clearly understood by the draftspersons. And who are these draftspersons? In this particular case, it is S. Shankaran, who is greatly admired by civil society, D. Bandyopadhyay. These are the guys who sat together and crafted that legislation. For those who want to verify what I am saying, please look at only one definition clause, and that is the bonded labor system. The definition of that system is based upon an anthropological understanding of who is the bonded laborer. How come during the emergency you could produce a legislation of this variety? It's as if, you know, the opportunity of emergency was necessary for good IAS officers to come out with this kind of legislation. It's not just one. The Equal Remuneration Act, I'm sure Madhu would support that wholeheartedly. Even now, the new law that seeks to incorporate Equal Remuneration Act is compelled to take on board the same provisions under the new legislation. Another law which is of, I think, such a nature that no other country in the world has produced that kind of law so far as labor jurisprudence is concerned. And this is the law relating to what we call as job losses. That is, if you want to have a layoff, or you want to retrench, or you want to close, you have to take the permission of the government. And without permission, if you do any of these three, it is illegal. And it will invite not only penalty, but an illegal closure would mean that workers will have to be paid full wages for the period of closure. I've used this provision in the Labor Department and in the Karnataka High Court, in the single bench and in the appellate, and got crores of rupees for the benefit of workers when there was a mala fide closure. So that is again, supported by the Sikh Industries Companies Act. It also gave us the potential to revive an industry which is closed for extraneous reasons, or there's an attempt to illegally close Karnataka Soaps and Detergents Limited. The factory in Bangalore, which was founded by Sir M. Visvesvaraya, more than 100 years old. And sandalwood was introduced into Karnataka, it was said by Hyder Ali. I'm sure Ram Guha would, check whether what I'm saying is correct, and that would be useful. But that factory was intended to be closed down. And we use these provisions in order to say, no, this is mala fide. There is really no loss there. It's an induced loss in order to facilitate privatization. Cami, with the producer of Cami soap, they want to take away this factory. And if you want to take it away, you must show that there is a loss on the balance sheet. And therefore, we were able to expose that. So I'm just mentioning this in order to indicate, what is the type of legislation which was introduced during that period. It belongs to an extraordinary category. It has tremendous relevance today. Even the new regime has not been able to repeal this law. They have just made it a little more, the threshold has been raised from 100 workers to 300. And in that sense, they defeat the purpose of the law. But in the context of non-performing assets, in that context, this is a legislation which is actually extremely useful legislation. And gladly, the framework of it continues to exist. Let me then, in order to demonstrate the proposition that I am putting across, when we look at these 4 labor codes, the new labor codes, our criticism of it is that it is extremely discriminatory. And that code which is most discriminatory is the Social Security Code. It is discriminatory to the extent that organized labor, they get good social security measures. It's in keeping with the standard that the ILO has laid down in the 1950s, ILO Convention number 102. That is satisfied in the Indian social security legislation. If you look at just the ESI Act and the Employees Provident Fund Act. But then when it comes to the unorganized sector, there's a discrimination and they are not entitled to it. There's a pretension that there is universalization of social security. But if you read through it at a deeper level, you find that organized workers are given statutory enforceable benefits and unorganized labor is promised a pie in the sky. It depends on some scheme for which there is no assured legislation. Why do I mention this in this context? In order to point out that the other type of labor legislation which came during the emergency relates exactly to this. There is, the family pension scheme was introduced in 1976. It's a very valuable social security measure. The employees deposit linked insurance scheme was introduced in 1976. The BD Workers Welfare Fund was introduced in 1976. The BD Workers Welfare Cess Act was introduced in 1976. The Payment of Bonus Act was introduced in 1976 amendment. And as a result of it, maximum number of strikes in India have been around the question of bonus, because there's no way to find out what is the legitimate quantum of bonus that an employer has to pay. Now, as a result of these amendments, that was codified in a manner in which in the first stage it was 4%, second stage it became 8.33%, and that is the law even today. 8.33% bonus means for working for 12 months, you will get a 13th month wage. And that's, you can imagine how useful it is for especially the poorer sections of the workers. So there was a realization that employers, escape from implementation, and therefore provisions for implementation were tightened. 3 years imprisonment was prescribed if you did not contribute to the ESI Social Security scheme. So in that sense, here is just a quick example of the number of labor laws which were enacted during the period that is considered to be the emergency period. There's much more, but that I suppose would be too long for today's session. But I think this is an aspect which we must examine in greater detail, because connected with that, in a sense, Ramchandra Guha raised this issue, and we must see what its links would be. And I would like to just mention this link, namely to ask the question, is there any difference between the earlier type of capitalism and the contemporary capitalism that India is following? I think that is the question that also opens up. That only then we go into a deeper comparison of what is happening between emergency and what is happening now. We know, if you go back, the history of social democracy in India, as picked up by Nehru and Ambedkar, both of them were after all Fabian socialists. So the type of Indian capitalism was a different type of capitalism. What is happening to that form of capitalism? Ironically, even Modi his regime is beginning to realize that Atmanirbharata has become necessary. What's the significance of that? It is because, all their imagination of going into neoliberalism is not working. And the last point I want to make in this context is, what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is the implementation of the Washington Consensus. And India has followed it hook, line, and sinker. And so when you are implementing that neoliberalism, it's across the world. We are aware of the fact, I've discussed this with Arvin, that there is a school of scholars who are talking of new constitutionalism. They want to kick the ladder after they have achieved certain stability in their own countries. and they would like to, have propaganda in favor of new constitutionalism. Given the fact that in India, this comes during the period of neoliberalism, I think it should be called by its proper name, and the proper name would be neo-constitutionalism. So on the one hand, the aspect which Arvind has so brilliantly exposed, especially the Hindutva dimension, and on the other hand, the dimension of neoliberalism. And when both of them come together, where are we in respect to the period that lies ahead? That also already in terms of inequality, Arvind has picked up that aspect and started dealing with it in the context of Piketty's writings. And I think therefore this opens up a lot of material for a different kind of activism. I welcome very much the Rainbow Coalition that Arvind has in mind, and more efforts is necessary in order to spell out these aspects. Thank you, Arvind, for giving us a beautiful book, very useful for us.
Thank you, Professor Babu Matthew. We will now open the forum for questions, and also kindly raise your hands if you all want to make comments or share your thoughts or want to say something. Leo, is somebody following the questions on Facebook? I don't get to see that here.
I have been trying to follow questions, but there have not been any. There are a few comments here, and we can, the comments are more in terms of agreeing. But yes, I think this would be a good time to actually take direct questions or, contributions from the audience.
Yeah, we have Mr. Gopal Krishna. Please go ahead, Mr. Gopal Krishna. Mr. Gopal Krishna, can you hear us? I see that you've raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you very much. Going further, taking cue from Ram, to defeat BJP or to defeat the totalitarian regime, the current system of electoral system of first past the post will not be conducive. Can we initiate discussions on representative government based on proportional representation of the parties to have a say in the cabinet? This can be further discussed. Yeah, maybe Professor Babu Matthew can throw some light on this.
Okay.
No, I think Ram Guha is better to deal with this issue.
So very quickly, I think you'll need a new Constituent Assembly. So you're not going to get it. We have to deal with reality as it is. I agree with you that there are many advantages to proportional representation, as shown by some of the European countries, but it cannot happen. So we are stuck with the West. However, there can be tweaks to it. One tweak recommended by the Association of Democratic Reforms, which along with the Alternative Law Forum and the Environment Support Group and other CEDs and so on, is one of the wonderful civil society organizations in Bangalore. They recommend that in every constituency, the winner must get 50% plus one. So if it is Kanakpura assembly seat, the first two, if one person gets more than 50%, he or she is declared the winner of the popular vote. If it's split 3 or 4 ways, you have a runoff between the first and second candidates. This can be easily achieved. But what I'd like, if with the permission of the other panelists, is maybe Arvind should first briefly respond to what others have said. I think that let the author speak, rather than we have said enough. So I think the author should speak.
Yeah. Over to you, Arvind. Agree completely.
The only thought in my head is really thank you for really a range of comments and really the ideas. How do we take the discussion forward? And the book is generating a conversation. And I think this discussion is short. It's that the conversation has been generated in a very, very powerful, very, very important way. Babu's invocation of labor laws, I think very important. Ram, I think it gets to the context of disciplines. I realized, I betrayed my the legal backing or legal foundations in looking at the emergency through the Francine Frankel kind of a lens. And she takes the viewpoint very, very strongly. The emergency was at best a shallow commitment to labor issues, at best, from a political science perspective, from a political theory perspective. But I think a legal analysis throws a very different light on it. So it's something for me to think about. And what accounted for these legislations. And if you go down that route, with the Patents Act as well, comes during the emergency time period. So a range of legislation which come in that time period in this particular legislation point, So I think that's a point which is we have to consider a lot more closely. I have to consider a lot more closely. So I think I have more. I don't have immediate answers. I have more, shall we say, thoughts, saying that these are conversations or thinking which I really need to take forward to see how to take this discussion for really forward. And Ram's again, the invocation of the difference between the emergency and the contemporary period and the differences. I should point out too that the one initially my thought was that one of the differences was that the contemporary rooting in a certain kind of communal thinking, and the emergency is not being rooted in that particular dimension. But then Ram pointed out to the fact that a close look at the Shah Commission will indicate that's not true. That there's a communal lens or a framework within which even the emergency was approached. So I think there is even the question of similarities and differences. I have to go back to again at the end of this kind of this conversation and this discussion. Really, I mean, often in a conversation, you have one has a pat answer and say, no, I agree or disagree, but I don't feel that way at all in this particular conversation. I feel questions have been thrown which I need to think about and get back to maybe in a longer email to each of the panelists. And Madhu, equally, thank you again for a very poetic and very, very moving invocation, again, of your core on very, very important strength, which is the idea of culture and the democratic possibilities within culture. Again, if the book bears an imprint of that line of thinking, as you indicated, it's really come from the kind of conversations I've had over a number of years with you, where you very often said that, what is this rights question, which you often ask me, and you push me to think a little more from the cultural lens. And so in a sense, I think the trying to weave together the lens of culture and the lens of law comes from the conversations we've had. So I think I just have to say again, thank you for your contribution to this dimension of the book. And Leo and Bhargavi, again, I just have to say thanks for that really incredibly spontaneous and important statement, saying that, let's do a discussion on this book. And I think the value, at least I see, in the course of the discussion. So thank you to really all the panelists.
Thank you. Thanks, Arvin. Kindly stay with us. We just have a couple of hands, and then each of the speakers can get a couple of minutes for some closing thoughts. Deepak Walker, would you like to share your thoughts?
Thank you very much. I am Deepak Vaikar, not Walker. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I know you are used to the different pronunciation. First of all, I would like to thank all the panelists, especially the author, Arvin Narayan, for giving us comprehensive view about constitutionality. My only question is, at present, can we still call, considering the elections are happening in a democratic way, considering, as rightly mentioned by Ram, that it is not 100% ruled by BJP in all the states, is it right to call it as a totalitarian regime? I can say can a majoritarian, okay, because I think we know from the fact that during Congress regime or even the regional regimes, it is minority appeasement kind of policies they implement, whether it's electoral, whatever. And then now, obviously, the pendulum has shifted to the majoritarian. So both way, it is not in conducive for the democracy. Whether it is when you appease minority for the electoral gains, specifically continuing your regime, is also not healthy for democracy, and the other way around also is not healthy. So that my question to panelists, especially to our author, I think Ram mentioned this one. I think why you are considering this as a totalitarian regime, which I believe it is not.
Ram, you want to take that?
I think Arvin, the rest Arvin. So Arvin should answer.
Arvin?
I'll just keep it very, very brief. The book goes in some detail into this. And the idea is that, again, I don't say it's a totalitarian regime. I use the phrase of it's slouching towards totalitarianism or moving towards totalitarianism. Again, it's really the understanding of what do you mean by total, right? The idea of a total control is one dimension of it. And the idea that totalitarianism as an ideology is based on a fundamental lack of respect for difference and diversity. And if we see the different actions of this regime, it shows you that fundamental kind of a dislike of difference and diversity, be it diversity in terms of gender, diversity in terms of sexuality, diversity in terms of religion, diversity in terms of culture, and there's a kind of a political monotheism, which is at the heart of this regime. And so that's where the invocation of a totalitarian dimension comes in. And I think the point of, if you're talking about a control over the food that you eat, control of the person you choose to love, you see something which is going a little beyond an authoritarian dimension. And here it's about militarization and a activation of society as well. The project of the RSS is not just control of the state, it's about alteration of the societal common sense. And that's the far more dangerous dimension one is pointing to when it uses the word of moving towards a totalitarian.
May I just add one dimension here, Bhargavi? I just want Arvin to go a little deeper because Babu also raised this. I mean, when Babu's analysis was coming out, it was essentially to say that though the emergency took away fundamental freedoms and fundamental rights, there was a sense of trying to do some justice in the emergency of the 1970s. And the socialist dimension seems to have come out. But the question has also been raised by Ram and Madhu as well. The nature of capital obviously is extractive now. It's extractive developmentalism, which is morphed with the question of majoritarianism, but also the way in which the advantage, both capital as well as the dominant politics has taken of the pandemic. You see, in crushing resistance, in dismembering resistance. I have not completed reading of your book. And obviously when you wrote it, maybe there are dimensions of how the Epidemics Diseases Act, for instance, has been used. The way in which people have been made powerless. You see, but at the same time, people also, you can also see the elite has gained, like, you use Piketty's analysis, but also we know many reports which have come out even a couple of days ago about how much more wealth has been added in the top 10% in the last 2 years. So has it all not played a part in actually trying to stymie open discussions such as this everywhere? And also resistance of a nature which we saw active in the 1970s, when we didn't have social media even.
Yeah, Arvind, you want to add more to?
Thanks, Leo, for the question. Again, I think Babu come back to the emergency and the question of the Shah Commission and the way they look at the labor question. Their analysis not on grounds of legislation, but their analysis on grounds of who the people arrested. And among the 4 categories of people who are arrested, trade union activist students. One of them is labor activists. Labor activists and trade union activists, along with students and along with political activists. So from that they derive the understanding of the shallow commitment to the question of the rights of labor as far as the emergency regime was concerned. That's the way the Shah Commission's analysis goes about it. So perhaps one point we can get from that, linking up to Leo's question, is the idea that it was a top-down model of a regime which said, I'm going to implement this or implement this kind of an ideology. It didn't have that kind of a linking up to people who are labor activists at the ground level, especially trade union activists. So that might be one other dimension of the particular emergency regime. And coming to Leo's point, which I completely agree with, is that the current current regime, in terms of, even if you look at the current regime, if you look at it in terms of capitalism, Piketty's point is this, right? You have in the earlier period of time, you had a capitalist regime which is social democratic. That is the point from the end of World War I, right up to the 1980s. Obviously, the kind of capitalist regime we have now is very, very different. And here Piketty is hearkening back to the capitalism of the robber baron's time, which is the time of the unconstrained part of capital. Again, Piketty's point is this, right? The high levels of inequality you see today, the last time you saw it was really in the time post the French Revolution, right up to the emergence of World War I. So it is a very different model of capitalism. And is it a cyclical model? Is it something new? Is a question to ask. But the levels of inequality and the fact that more people don't have a stake in the system is the fundamental point. I mean, when Leo's making the point that in the pandemic, a couple of billionaires win out, large majority of people lose out. How sustainable is that arrangement over a longer period of time? Obviously, the earlier arrangement, which is 1914 to 1980, was sustainable over that period of time. We're not in that sustainable phase of capitalism, is one way to think about it.
Thank you, Arvin. We have one question from Mr. Diaz. Mr. Diaz, can you hear us?
Yeah, I'll come in. Yes. Thanks to Arvin for that great presentation.
Also help if you turn on your camera so we at least get personal.
Sure.
Hopefully.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, good on. Thanks to Arvin for that great presentation, and of course the great book that we are all waiting to read. Go with the video. Yeah, okay. Yeah, the video has been stopped. Anyway, and also for the great responses of the respondents there. Some of them, of course, we have known them, heard them before. I expressed concerns actually. One is about fear in terms of mobilization. So we would like resistance, more mobilization against the regime and against the atrocities, etc. But the fear seems to be stopping this or slowing this down. Tremendous amount of fear in the minority communities. And another concern is that of the apathy of the middle classes. So the middle class apathy, the so-called educated class. And from what we hear and see is that they're also being co-opted by the regime. You may call it totalitarian. I would like to call it fascist state, you know. And I don't think we should hesitate to call them by their name, by the real name. So these are some of the concerns. How would you all, any panelist can, of course, address these.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz. Who would like to take that?
Just very quickly, I'll just make one point. This is relevant particularly to what's happening in Karnataka now. Arvin briefly mentioned M.S. Golwalkar, who's really was the Sarsanchalak of the RSS from 1938 to 1973 and really built the modern RSS ideologically and institutionally. And in his book, Bunch of Thoughts, he identifies three enemies of the nation: Muslims, Christians, and communists. Now, communists are very marginal in India. I mean, only really, it's only Kerala that they control, and they're not really revolutionary communists, they're democratic communists. But in the RSS worldview and also in the larger ecosystem, the hatred for Christians can sometimes equal the hatred for Muslims. One has to go into a sociological, psychological explanation for this, but they think that they're backed by the power of the West and and of course the English language and British colonization and so on. And in this government, there is one man who does not come from an RSS background, which may be the only positive qualification he has, who is our Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, who understands that in the present climate, demonization of Christians hurts India's position vis-a-vis the United States, whose friendship is much valued by the Modi regime. So I don't know how many people know that the original draft of the Citizenship Amendment Act also excluded Christians, not just Muslims. So it was Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains who would get refuge if they came from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, not Christians, because in that RSS worldview, Christians are as much to be stigmatized and hated, even though they're a much smaller minority and so on. I mean, like Muslims don't really pose any kind of threat to Hindu dominance. But I think the Foreign Office was able to prevail on Modi to say Trump is supported by the evangelicals, include Christians in this. Now, if you see what's happening with the Mumbai government today, so far, it's more Christian stigmatization. It more, of course, it doesn't exclude Muslim stigmatization. And I think that is one aspect. I think that people, it's a significant aspect of the RSS ideology. That often when you listen to Modi, Shah, Adityanath, you may forget. You may think that it's exclusively the Muslims they're targeting. Of course, the Indian Muslims are their main target, but there's this subterranean thing too. And of course, that's something which must always, one should not lose sight of. And it's, of course, no doubt is deeply worrying. And now the question of the apathy of the middle class is a more complicated matter. It has a lot to do, I think, with the atomization of society, not just fear. Fear is, of course, absolutely there. But also the atomization of society, what social media does to the lack of social solidarity and so on. That's again a separate question. But I just wanted to put this on the table, that actually deep down, they hate Christians as much as they hate Muslims. That's part of the pathology.
So thank you, Ram. We are way past our time, but 2 minutes of closing thoughts to each of our speakers for today. We could start from Professor Babu Matthew.
Oh, I was enjoying everything so much, I didn't think of another 2 minutes, so I'll pass.
Madhu?
Yeah, I think I will follow Babu's example, because when I was just listening, so no, I just want to again congratulate all of you and Arvind. And I think it's important. I think this conversation has been very, very important, not only to understand the times that we're living in, but also to understand what should be the sources of our dissent and resistance. For me, that is very, very important. And that is why I found his last chapter so fascinating, because I think, yes, this is a kind of, a state that we're living in. And like I said, it's not new to women who've constantly lived in this kind of a state. But I think it's the resistance in this particular context that is so important. And I think that is where he makes the most valuable, for me, the most valuable kind of, perhaps the only thing I would like to say is that, again, to go back to the constitution and culture, it's not a dichotomy. I think it's, it is together. But yes, the constitution is a tool, in that sense. It is an instrument, to hold the state accountable. And I think we should, use it as such. But I think Bal Gopal, in fact, it's very interesting that he goes beyond that. He says it is also a set of values, so it's a set of values that needs to be lived. It's not just an instrument that has to be deployed, but it's a set of values that should be internalized, by society. And I think that's absolutely essential if we have to really counter totalitarianism, authoritarianism of all kinds. And in that sense, culture too, cannot be seen as just an instrument, of any ideology, including resistance. Culture is something that has to be embraced in all its complexities and contradictions, and it needs to be engaged with the way that, ordinary people are engaging with it on the ground. They are engaging with it. They're feeling the weight of this authoritarianism and totalitarianism and the kind of increasing divisiveness in our society. But I think they're also engaging and negotiating and resisting it, So I think one needs to, embrace that and not just deploy culture as a tool against it. I don't know if I made myself, if it made sense. Yeah.
Absolutely, Madhu. Thank you. Ram?
I'm fine. I'll just to say thank you for hosting this, and it's been a privilege to be part of this. And congratulations to Arvind again.
Leo? Would you like to say something?
I think I'll let Arvind say his 2 words, and then I just want to read out some comments that have come.
Okay, over to you, Arvin.
Again, just thank you everybody for really very generous engagement with the work, reading it closely, and coming back with your thoughts. It's meant a lot to hear all of your comments. And thanks to Leo and Bhargavi for really pulling this together. So just thanks again from my end.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks,
to all our speakers. Yeah, Leo.
I saw that Suprabha has her hand raised. If she's still there, because she's, I know, up on a mountain to catch the signal, so she can talk from Wayanad. I hope it's not raining there.
Suprabha, can you hear us? Over to you.
Hi.
You have to unmute yourself.
We can
Thank you so much for organizing this, Leo and Bhargavi. And I just had this question to Arvind and perhaps to the others as well about whether Arvind, in the writing of the book, the idea of India was sort of playing in your mind, and where are you with that? What is the idea of India that you hold to and that you are sharing with us? Because I feel that is what is so profoundly starkly demarcated between the two regimes that I can gather from this discussion. But what is the idea of India that you held to? And maybe it's too late for this particular, it's at the very end of the talk, but that was in my mind.
Yeah, Arvind.
Yeah, no, just in 2 lines, I think Madhu and Ram and Babu and Leo and Bhargavi captured it in terms of the range of references which are there as far as the book is concerned, right from Gandhi and Ambedkar to Tagore to Bal Gopal to Kanabhiran, right? And to me, all these figures really capture what you'd call the idea of India.
So I just want to add that, Maya Sharma says, both panelists and Arvind for writing the book on such critical issues. Sashikala Seturao says, I derive hope from the ordinary decency of ordinary people that I meet every day. Kalpana Chakravarti says, one of the fundamental difference between then and now, the regimes, is the consensus that undeclared emergency has been able to garner both in terms of reach and nature, the open legitimization of divisive politics. And Arvind, Mohan Rao has said that he has not got an autographed copy of your book, and I would say that everyone who has participated deserve an autographed copy of your book in addition to the 40% discount. I'm sorry about Westland losing business, but I think more people read this book and spread the word, the better it is for democracy. So yeah, really, and yeah, so there are these comments, and others who have spoken have also commented, so I won't read them out. Yeah, but this has been a inspiring and very, very deeply thought-provoking conversation, and I'm happy that it was a conversation and you all made it possible. Thank you very much. Yeah, Bhargavi.
Yeah, thanks, Leo. And so on behalf of all the organizers, I would like to thank all our speakers and Arvind for agreeing to be part of this book talk. And our special thanks to PUCL, Manthan Law, Westland Books for co-hosting this event. Special thanks to Varun John for putting it all together from the Zoom perspective, sending emails and all the tech support that he gave. And to our student interns who've very quickly learned how to tweet and put a Twitter report together, actually. So if you all go to your Twitter account, you all will see that they've already tweeted continuously. Kindly share them, further retweet them, and also share the event on Facebook so that more people will get to see it. We will look forward to many more discussions in the coming days on this book, and we'll be happy to again bring more discussions with student communities, the general public, anyone, anywhere, if possible, who will want to, discuss this, because I think for the next 1 year, having these conversations is very important. And thanks again, and good night, everybody.
I just want to say that this report will also be, we'll try and make a report. It's too dense to make a report just like that. I'll request Arvin to also help us in writing the report. But that apart, we are going to video the video will be available on ESG India's YouTube page, and we'll share the link with everyone who's participated, also otherwise. And if there are any mistakes in tweeting what you guys said, please excuse us. You can go there and edit it or put your edited version of what you meant to say. But apologies in advance if we have mistweeted you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good night.
Good night. Yeah, bye-bye.
Be free.